The flight of dreams and doubts. Jordan Hayes stood at the massive windows of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, his 12-year-old heart pounding with excitement as he gazed at the gleaming Boeing 787 Dreamliner parked at the gate. His small hands clutched his first-class boarding pass tightly, almost as if he were afraid it would slip from his fingers. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of for years. His fascination with airplanes had started when he was barely old enough to talk. While other kids collected action figures and toy cars, Jordan had been obsessed with aircraft. He memorized flight paths, watched countless aviation videos, and even built detailed models of commercial jets in his room. And now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't just an observer. He was about to experience the luxury of first-class travel. "Jordan, slow down. You're going to tire yourself out before we even get on the plane," his mother, Camille Hayes, said with a chuckle as she walked beside him, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag. Jordan barely heard her. His eyes were glued to the sleek jet that would soon carry him across the ocean. He could already imagine the plush seats, the gourmet meals, and the gentle hum of the engines as he soared above the clouds. "This is going to be amazing," he whispered under his breath. Camille smiled softly, watching the excitement dance in her son's eyes. She understood. This was a special day, one carefully planned by her husband, Malcolm Hayes. He had surprised them with first-class tickets, a rare luxury, as a way of celebrating Jordan's achievements in school. It was a reward for his dedication, his hard work, and most of all, his passion for aviation. As they made their way toward the priority boarding lane, Jordan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. For once, he wasn't stuck in the long, snaking lines of economy passengers. He wasn't just another kid traveling with his mom. He was stepping into a world he had only seen in glossy magazines and travel shows. A flight attendant stood at the entrance of the boarding area, her polished smile in place as she scanned tickets and greeted passengers. Jordan nearly bounced on his heels when it was his turn. He handed over his boarding pass with both hands, as if offering something sacred. The scanner beeped, and the woman glanced at the ticket. "Welcome aboard," she said smoothly, returning it to him. Jordan grinned and took a deep breath. He stepped forward, past the threshold that separated ordinary travelers from those who flew in luxury. But just as he entered the jet bridge, a strange sensation washed over him. A flicker of unease. It was faint, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. Maybe it was just nerves. He shook it off. This was going to be the best flight of his life. The first-class cabin was everything he had imagined, and more. The seats were wide and luxurious, made of fine leather with enough space to recline fully. Each had a personal entertainment screen, a welcome drink waiting on the armrest, and an air of exclusivity that set it apart from the cramped rows of economy. The soft scent of citrus and fresh linen filled the air, adding to the ambience of sophistication. Jordan's seat was 4A, right by the window, his favorite spot. He practically skipped to it, running his fingers over the smooth leather. This was it. This was where he belonged. But then, "Excuse me, young man." The voice was polite, but there was something in its tone that made Jordan freeze. He turned to see a woman in a crisp navy blue uniform standing in front of him, another flight attendant. Her smile was still in place, but there was something off about it. It was thinner, more forced. "This section is for first-class passengers only," she said. Jordan blinked, confused. I know," he replied, holding up his boarding pass with a small, confident smile. "I'm in first class." The woman's gaze flicked to the pass in his hand. For a moment, there was silence. Then, instead of stepping aside, she asked, "Where did you get this ticket?" Jordan's heart sank. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. "My dad got it for me." There was a brief pause, just long enough for doubt to creep into his mind. "Let me check with the front desk," the woman said, motioning to a fellow crew member. "Just stay right here." Passengers around them started to take notice. The businessman in a charcoal gray suit adjusted his tie, sneaking a glance from behind his laptop. A woman sipping champagne lowered her flute ever so slightly. The murmurs started, soft, barely audible, but Jordan felt them in his chest. His mother had gone to the restroom before boarding. He was alone. And suddenly, for the first time since stepping onto the plane, he didn't feel welcome. He felt like an intruder. The first-class attendant continued to stand in front of him, blocking his path to his seat as if he were a trespasser. The businessman across the aisle stole another glance, his brows slightly furrowed. The woman in the cream-colored blazer let out a soft sigh and shook her head before turning away. Jordan felt his ears burn. The other flight attendant returned, this time with the older male crew member who had disappeared to check his ticket. The man looked at the pass, his expression unreadable. "We weren't able to find an issue with the booking," he admitted. But there it was again. The hesitation. Jordan's stomach twisted. But what? The female flight attendant still didn't step aside. She turned to her colleague, voice lower now, but Jordan still caught the words. Could it be an upgrade that wasn't processed correctly? Upgrade? Jordan suddenly understood. They thought he didn't belong here. They thought he had somehow ended up in first class by accident. And just like that, the excitement of his first-class experience crumbled. Then, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Jordan's head snapped up. His mother. Camille stood at the entrance of the cabin, her expression unreadable. But Jordan knew her well enough to see the fire behind her calm gaze. The flight attendant turned, her smile polite but strained. "Ma'am, we're just verifying your son's seat assignment. There seems to be a mix-up." Camille's eyes flicked to Jordan, then to the ticket in his hand. Without hesitation, she held out her hand. "Let me see that." The flight attendant hesitated before handing it over. One glance. That's all it took. "This isn't a mix-up," Camille said, her voice smooth but firm. "My son is in seat 4A. Silence. The older flight attendant cleared his throat. "We weren't able to find an issue with the booking." "But?" Camille asked. More hesitation. Camille let out a slow breath, the kind she only took when she was holding back. She turned to Jordan, her expression softening. "Sit down, lady." Jordan obeyed, sliding into his seat, but his hands still felt clammy. The flight attendant stood there for a moment longer, as if considering whether to push the issue further. But Camille wasn't backing down. The businessman across the aisle shifted. Then, with a patronizing smile, he said, "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. You know, they have to be careful about security these days." Jordan's stomach dropped. Camille turned to him, slowly, as if weighing her words. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice dangerously polite. "And what exactly are they securing my son from?" The man's mouth opened, then closed. Camille let her gaze linger for just a moment longer before turning back to Jordan. She placed a comforting hand on his knee. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "We're staying right here." But Jordan knew, deep in his chest, that this wasn't over. A seat at the table, a battle for respect. Jordan sat stiffly in his first-class seat, the tension around him as thick as the scent of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee that lingered in the air. His hands clenched the armrests, his breathing shallow. The once thrilling idea of sitting in luxury now felt more like sitting in a courtroom, waiting for a verdict. His mother, Camille, remained composed beside him. But Jordan knew better. That wasn't calm. It was restraint. He had seen this look before. It was the same expression she wore whenever someone tried to test her patience, a storm simmering beneath the surface. The businessman across the aisle had returned his attention to his laptop, but Jordan caught how he occasionally peeked over, his fingers motionless on the keyboard. A few other passengers had shifted uncomfortably, now fully aware that something was happening, something that for some reason made them uneasy. And the worst part, the flight attendant was still standing there, still watching him, still hesitating. The supervisor, A woman in a navy blazer and an expression that teetered between fake sympathy and rigid professionalism had now joined the scene. She held a tablet in one hand, scanning through passenger information with a forced smile. "Mrs. Hayes," she began, her voice deliberately even, "I understand your concern. We just want to ensure everything is in order." Camille leaned back in her seat and crossed her arms. "Everything is in order. My son's ticket was purchased. It was scanned. He's in his assigned seat. What exactly are you checking?" The supervisor hesitated. The pause was just a little too long, the kind of pause that gave away more than words ever could. Jordan shifted uncomfortably. He didn't need anyone to say it out loud. He already knew. They weren't checking because of some mistake. They were checking because of him. Because they had seen him, a black boy, dressed in simple jeans and sneakers, walking into a space they didn't expect him to be in. His mother had told him about moments like this before, but he had never felt it. Not until now. The supervisor cleared her throat, glancing down at the tablet again. "It's just a security measure." Camille let out a short, disbelieving laugh. A security measure. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, but Jordan could hear the sharpness in her tone. "Tell me something," she continued. "How many other first-class passengers have you checked today? How many boarding passes have you double-verified? Because I didn't see you questioning him." She nodded toward the businessman in the suit, or her. She motioned toward the woman in the cream blazer. The supervisor stiffened, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hayes, that's not." Camille held up a hand. "Save it." The woman's mouth snapped shut. Jordan's chest felt tight. He wanted to disappear. He wanted the conversation to be over, for the flight to just take off so he could pretend none of this had happened. But it was happening, and it wasn't going away. Jordan felt something cold settle in his stomach as he looked around, seeing how people watched but said nothing. They all knew, but none of them spoke up. Not a single one. The older flight attendant finally exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, let's just move on. The ticket is valid. The seat is his." The female attendant, the one who had started this whole thing, pressed her lips together, as if swallowing words she wanted to say. But she said nothing. Finally, she took a small step back. Jordan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. But Camille wasn't done. She turned to Jordan and placed a reassuring hand on his knee before looking back at the supervisor. "You may not like seeing my son here," she said, her voice low but steady, "but you will respect that he belongs here. Understand?" The woman gave a tight nod, her lips thin. "Yes, Mom." Camille tilted her head, studying her for a moment before finally sitting back in her seat. Jordan clenched his jaw and stared out the window. He should have felt relieved. The situation was technically over, but the weight of it still pressed against his chest. Why did it have to take so much? Why did his mom have to fight just for him to sit in a seat that was already his? His thoughts were interrupted by the deep, familiar voice that sent a shockwave through the cabin. What's the problem here? Jordan's entire body tensed. His father had arrived. Malcolm Hayes stood in the aisle, his broad frame casting a shadow over the seats. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, crisp white shirt, and polished dress shoes, he looked every bit the powerful businessman that he was. Jordan saw the way the supervisor's spine straightened immediately, the way the attendants exchanged nervous glances. His father wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. But his presence alone was enough to send a ripple of discomfort through the air. The businessman who had made that little security comment quickly turned back to his laptop. The woman in the cream blazer suddenly found the in-flight menu very interesting. And the flight attendants. They knew. "Mr. Hayes," the supervisor said quickly, forcing a smile. "There was just a small misunderstanding, but everything is fine now." Malcolm tilted his head. A misunderstanding. His voice was dangerously smooth. Jordan watched as his father reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times. The flight attendant who had questioned Jordan's ticket shifted uncomfortably. The supervisor cleared her throat. "Sir, we just wanted to make sure everything was in order." Malcolm gave a slow nod, then said, "I just got off the phone with the regional manager for this airline." The color drained from the supervisor's face. "She'll be very interested," Malcolm continued, sliding his phone back into his pocket, "in hearing how my son and wife were treated today." The supervisor inhaled sharply. "Mr. Hayes, I assure you." Malcolm raised a hand, cutting her off. "Save it." The words echoed like a hammer in the silence. Jordan's chest swelled. The power had shifted. It was subtle, but undeniable. And then his father delivered the final blow. "Seeing as how I own the airline," Malcolm added casually, "I'd like to discuss this situation with corporate. I think a training session might be necessary." Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin. Jordan felt the shift. The supervisor's breath hitched. The flight attendant took a small step back. The businessman across the aisle, who had been so sure of himself moments ago, let out a small cough and focused intensely on his screen. The tension in the cabin was now a different kind of tension. Malcolm turned to his wife. "Camille, are you all right?" She smirked, adjusting the strap of her handbag. "I am now." Then he looked at Jordan. "Son." Jordan hesitated, then nodded. He didn't feel fine. But at least now, they knew. They all knew. Malcolm exhaled slowly, then looked back at the supervisor. "We'll be having a conversation after the flight," he said smoothly. "Make sure you're available." The supervisor swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." And just like that, it was over. For now. But Jordan knew something had changed. Not just in the cabin. Not just in the crew. But in him. Because today, he had learned something he would never forget. It wasn't enough to just be in the room. Sometimes, you had to prove you belonged. And even though he hated that, he knew one thing for sure. They would never doubt him again. Knowing your worth in a world that doubts you. The hum of the aircraft's engines filled the cabin. A steady, soothing sound that should have marked the beginning of a peaceful journey. But for Jordan, the sound did little to erase the knot of tension still sitting in his chest. He sat in his plush leather seat, staring out the window at the endless runway, his reflection barely visible against the glass. He should have been excited. He was excited, wasn't he? This was his first international flight. He was in first class. He should have been counting down the minutes until takeoff, ready to experience the luxury his father had arranged as a special gift. But instead, his mind replayed the last 15 minutes over and over. The looks, the questions, the hesitation, the doubt. The way the flight attendant had blocked his path, as if he was the mistake. The way the businessmen had excused their actions with a casual security excuse. And worst of all, the fact that if his father hadn't shown up, would they have ever let it go? Would he have been forced to leave? Would they have made up an excuse, found a loophole, called it a glitch, and moved him to the back of the plane? His stomach twisted at the thought. Beside him, Camille let out a slow breath and placed a hand over his. "You okay, baby?" Jordan blinked and turned to her. He nodded automatically, but his mother wasn't fooled. She squeezed his fingers gently. "Talk to me." For a moment, Jordan didn't know what to say. There were too many emotions tangled inside him. Too many things he didn't quite understand how to put into words. "I don't get it," he finally muttered, staring at the seat in front of him. "Why'd they think I wasn't supposed to be here?" Camille sighed, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes lingering on the passengers who had watched but said nothing. "You already know why," she said softly. Jordan clenched his jaw. He did know. He just didn't want to believe it. The thing was, this wasn't the first time he had felt different. He had been one of only a few black kids in his advanced classes at school. He had heard the surprised voices of other parents when they learned he was at the top of his class. He had seen the hesitation in store clerks' eyes when he and his friends walked into expensive shops at the mall. It had always been there, a quiet, lingering presence. But this time, it wasn't quiet. This time, it was right in his face. And it stung. "They thought I didn't belong," Jordan whispered. Camille exhaled, brushing a hand over his curls. "But you do." Jordan swallowed. He wanted to believe her, but something inside him still ached. Across the aisle, his father shifted in his seat. Malcolm had been silent for the past few minutes, his expression unreadable as he flipped through a newspaper, a real, physical one, the way he always did on flights. Jordan had always thought his dad was cool, the kind of man who walked into a room and made people listen without even trying. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth. And right now, Jordan wished he could borrow just an ounce of that confidence. As if sensing his son's thoughts, Malcolm finally looked up. "Jordan," he said, folding the newspaper neatly and setting it aside. "Let me tell you something." Jordan straightened slightly, his father's serious tone pulling him out of his thoughts. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his sharp gaze locking onto his son's. "The world isn't always going to welcome you. It's not always going to be fair to you." Jordan swallowed hard. His father continued, "But you don't let that stop you. You don't let it make you shrink. You don't ask for permission to be in spaces that you earned your way into." Jordan nodded slowly, his fingers still gripping the armrest. Malcolm studied him for a moment, then said, "What you experienced today." He gestured around the cabin, toward the flight attendants still moving stiffly in the background. "That won't be the last time you face something like this." Jordan already knew that. "But the question is," his father continued, "next time it happens, how will you handle it?" Jordan hesitated. He thought about how he had frozen when the flight attendant questioned him, how his stomach had twisted in knots, how he had felt small, even though he had done nothing wrong. How would he handle it next time? Before he could answer, Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black leather wallet. He flipped it open and took out his business card, handing it to Jordan. It was simple, sleek, his name embossed in silver letters. Malcolm Hayes, CEO. Jordan stared at it. His father owned the airline. Yet still, they had questioned him. Still, they had looked at him and seen doubt. Jordan's hands tightened around the card. His father leaned back and crossed his arms. "Do you think my first-class ticket was ever questioned when I was your age?" Jordan didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Malcolm tilted his head. "You want to know what power really is, son." Jordan looked up. "Power isn't money. It's not a fancy seat. It's not even the title on that card." Malcolm's voice was calm but firm. "Power is knowing who you are, and never letting them make you question it." Jordan's chest tightened. Because for a moment, just a moment, he had questioned it. He had questioned whether he deserved to be here. And that was exactly what they had wanted. Camille smirked, watching her son absorb his father's words. She reached over, plucked the card from Jordan's hands, and slipped it into the front pocket of his hoodie. "Keep that," she said lightly. As a reminder, Jordan glanced down at the card, rubbing his thumb over the smooth texture. Maybe he would keep it, not because he needed to prove who his father was, but because it would remind him of who he was. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are cleared for takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for departure." The tension in the air shifted, replaced by the quiet rustling of passengers adjusting their seats and buckling in. The flight attendants were still moving stiffly, avoiding eye contact with their row. The businessman across the aisle was now furiously typing, probably some email that didn't need to be sent. Jordan exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. Then he did something small, but important. He relaxed. He let himself sink into the seat he had every right to be in. He wasn't going to shrink. He wasn't going to let them take away his excitement for this flight. He was going to enjoy it. As the plane accelerated down the runway, the engines roaring to life, Jordan let the tension slip from his chest. He turned to his mom and grinned. "Did you say something about warm chocolate chip cookies?" Camille smirked. "First-class perks, baby." Jordan nodded, finally allowing himself to smile. Yeah, he belonged here, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel otherwise. When the world doubts you, stand tall. The gentle hum of the engines and the slight tilt of the plane as it climbed into the sky should have been soothing. For most passengers, this was just another flight, a few hours of luxury before they reached their destination. For Jordan, however, this flight meant something else entirely. As the Boeing 787 soared through the clouds, he forced himself to relax against the leather seat, but his mind was still racing. The stares, the whispers, the doubt. No matter how much he tried to shake it off, the reality of what had happened still sat heavy in his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply walked onto the plane, excited for his first-class experience. Yet, the moment he stepped into that space, people questioned whether he belonged there. Jordan glanced around the first-class cabin. The businessman across the aisle was pretending to type, but Jordan could tell he was still paying attention. The woman in the cream blazer had settled in with a book, avoiding any more unnecessary glances in his direction. And then there were the flight attendants. They moved with the same polished grace as before, but now there was a stiffness in their steps. The female attendant, the one who had doubted his ticket, hadn't looked in his direction since his father's arrival. The supervisor, now thoroughly humbled, had retreated to the galley, clearly eager to put the situation behind her. But Jordan couldn't put it behind him. Not yet. His fingers brushed against the business card in his hoodie pocket, the embossed letters a quiet reminder of his father's words. Power is knowing who you are, and never letting them make you question it. He let out a slow breath and turned to his mother. "Mom." Camille looked up from the in-flight menu, arching a perfectly shaped brow. "What's on your mind, baby?" Jordan hesitated before asking the question that had been sitting in his gut since the moment this all started. Would this have happened if I looked different? His mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set down the menu and turned to fully face him, her dark eyes searching his. "You already know the answer, Jordan." Jordan's throat tightened. He did. And yet, part of him had hoped he was wrong. He looked down at his lap, his fingers gripping the fabric of his jeans. "It's not fair." "No, baby," Camille agreed softly. "It's not." He swallowed hard. "But I don't get it. Why does it even matter to them? Why did they care where I was sitting?" His mother let out a slow breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "It's not about where you were sitting," she said. "It's about what they expected to see. And when they saw you sitting in first class, looking the way you do, walking in like you belonged, it threw them off. Because in their minds, first class is for people like them, not for people like you." Jordan's stomach twisted. His mother reached over and gently squeezed his hand. "It's not your fault. It never was. But baby, you have to understand something. There are people in this world who will always look at you and assume you don't belong. It doesn't matter what you do, how smart you are, or even who your father is." Her eyes softened. "And sometimes that's going to hurt. But you can't let that stop you." Jordan let her words sink in, his mind spinning. He thought about the way the flight attendant had questioned his ticket, the way the businessman had excused it as security, the way people had stared but said nothing. Then he thought about his father. About the way Malcolm Hayes had walked in and shut it all down with a few words and a sharp look, about how he never let them see him flinch. Jordan wanted to be like that. But right now, he just felt tired. He glanced out the window, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. He had looked forward to this flight for so long. Now, All he wanted was to reach their destination. His father must have noticed his shift in mood, because Malcolm folded his newspaper and leaned forward slightly. Jordan. Jordan turned to him. His father studied him for a long moment before speaking. What happened back there? It wasn't right. But I want you to remember something. Jordan nodded. What? Malcolm rested his elbows on his knees, his expression unreadable. You didn't just learn something today. Jordan frowned. I didn't. His father smirked. No, they did. Jordan blinked. The flight attendants, the passengers who stared, the businessmen who made excuses, all of them, Malcolm continued. They learned something today. They learned that they can't just doubt you without consequences. That next time, they'll think twice before assuming they know who belongs where. Jordan sat with that for a moment. They thought they could make you feel small, his father added, leaning back in his seat. But look at you. Jordan glanced down at himself. He wasn't slouching anymore. His shoulders weren't hunched. The tension that had been sitting in his chest since the moment he stepped on the plane had started to ease. His father was right. He hadn't shrunk, and that was power. The realization settled in, steady and unshakable. This wasn't just about a plane seat. This was about the way the world worked. And more importantly, how he would face it. A soft ding sounded overhead as the seatbelt sign switched off, signaling that passengers were free to move around the cabin. Almost immediately, a flight attendant approached their row. Not the woman who had doubted him, a different one. She was young, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression careful but professional. Would you care for anything to drink? She asked, her voice polite. Camille glanced at Jordan. What do you say, baby? Jordan hesitated, then straightened slightly in his seat. He could pretend nothing happened. He could let it all slide. Or he could make sure they knew he was here. He met the flight attendant's gaze and smiled, his voice steady. I'll have a Sprite. A pause. Then the woman nodded. Of course. She turned and walked away, her steps just a little quicker than before. Camille smirked, handing in the menu. And what about those warm chocolate chip cookies? Jordan grinned. I think we should order a few extra. His father chuckled behind his newspaper. That's my boy. As the plane sailed smoothly through the sky, Jordan took a deep breath and let himself enjoy it. Because no matter what anyone thought, he belonged here. And nothing would ever change that. Owning the space you're in. The flight attendant returned a few moments later with Jordan's Sprite and a tray of warm chocolate chip cookies. The rich, sweet scent of melted chocolate filled the air as she set them down carefully on the polished tray table in front of him. Let me know if you need anything else, she said, her voice polite but noticeably careful. Jordan caught the subtle shift in her expression, the way she moved with just a little more hesitation, a little more awareness than before. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, embarrassment, or just the weight of the situation settling in. But one thing was clear. She knew. They all did. He thanked her with a small nod, watching as she turned swiftly and disappeared into the galley. Camille smirked as she took one of the cookies from the tray. You see that? Jordan raised an eyebrow. See what? The way she looked at you, his mother said, breaking her cookie in half and popping a piece into her mouth. That's a woman who knows she's got something to think about for the rest of the day. Jordan exhaled. You think she feels bad? Oh, definitely, Camille said, sipping her water. But whether or not she learned anything, that's up to her. Jordan chewed on his cookie slowly, considering his mother's words. Did it matter if she felt bad? Maybe. Maybe not. But what did matter was that she, and everyone else on this flight, had just witnessed something they weren't going to forget anytime soon. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a black kid with a first-class ticket stepped onto one of their flights, they'd think twice before questioning it. His father turned the page of his newspaper and glanced at Jordan over the top of it. You all right now? Jordan nodded. Yeah. Malcolm studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod in return. Good. It wasn't much. But Jordan understood. That was his father's way of saying, "You handled yourself well." That meant everything. Owning your space. As the flight continued, Jordan allowed himself to finally relax. He leaned back into the plush seat, sipping his Sprite, the tension in his body slowly unwinding. The businessman across the aisle had stopped glancing in their direction. Instead, he had settled into his seat, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. The woman in the cream blazer had put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones and closed her eyes. It was almost as if nothing had happened. But Jordan knew better. Because everything had changed. He had changed. He wasn't just sitting in this seat anymore. He was owning it. And the best part, nobody could take that away from him. His mother nudged him playfully. "So what's the first thing you're gonna do when we land?" Jordan grinned, thinking about it. "Definitely find the biggest burger I can." Camille laughed. "My kind of plan." Malcolm chuckled from behind his newspaper. "Just don't forget to stretch your legs first." Jordan smirked. "I dunno, Dad. I'm getting kind of used to all this legroom." His father shot him a knowing look. "Good, because one day I expect you to be flying your own jet." Jordan's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Malcolm folded his newspaper neatly, setting it aside. "What? You love planes, don't you?" Jordan nodded quickly. "Yeah, of course." "Then why not fly them?" his father said, his tone casual but laced with meaning. Jordan blinked. "You mean, like, be a pilot?" Malcolm shrugged. "If you want. Or maybe you design the next great aircraft. Or maybe you run your own airline one day. Who knows?" Jordan stared at him, his mind suddenly filled with possibilities he hadn't even considered before. He had always dreamed about flying. But owning, that was a whole different level. "Think big, son," Malcolm said, tapping his temple. "The world's gonna try and put limits on you. Don't let them." Jordan swallowed hard, his father's words sinking deep. Maybe this flight wasn't just about getting from one place to another. Maybe it was about more. Maybe it was about seeing himself in places that others thought he didn't belong, and then proving them wrong. Every single time. Camille reached over and tousled his curls. "Whatever you do, baby, just make sure you do it with confidence." Jordan nodded, a slow grin forming on his face. "Yeah, confidence. He could do that. He could do anything." Final reminder. As the plane flew high above the clouds, Jordan glanced out the window, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the endless sky. He reached into his hoodie pocket and felt for the business card his father had given him earlier. Malcolm Hayes, CEO. Jordan traced his fingers over the smooth edges, a quiet reminder of everything this flight had taught him. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about knowing who he was, and never letting anyone make him question it again. As he settled in, finishing off the last bite of his warm cookie, he let a small, satisfied smile creep onto his face. They had doubted him. They had assumed he didn't belong. But now they knew better. And next time, he wouldn't even give them a chance to question it. Because he wasn't just sitting in first class. He was meant to be here. And nothing would ever change that. When you walk into the room, own it. The warm glow of the cabin lights cast a soft hue over the first-class section as the flight settled into a steady rhythm. The hum of the engines was a comforting background noise, and the faint sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations filled the space. But for Jordan, the real noise was in his head. He had eaten his cookies, sipped his Sprite, and laughed with his parents. But deep inside, something still lingered. Not anger, not even frustration. Just realization. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to be the last time someone doubted him. And he wasn't just talking about flights. It would happen in school, in business, in life. People would always try to decide for him whether or not he was worthy of being in certain spaces, And if he didn't take charge of his own presence, if he hesitated, they would make that decision for him. That thought made his fingers curl into a fist. He didn't want to just get through situations like this. He didn't want to be relieved when it was over. He wanted to walk into places like this and own them from the start. He wanted to walk into a room and make people know, without a doubt, that he belonged, that he was meant to be there, that he wasn't going anywhere. The test of power. A flight attendant, the same one who had questioned his ticket, was walking back toward their row. Jordan noticed immediately. Her posture was stiff, her hands tightly gripping a silver tray. She was trying not to look nervous, but Jordan saw the way she swallowed before speaking. I wanted to offer you something from our premium dessert selection," she said carefully, setting down a plate with a delicate slice of chocolate mousse cake in front of him. Jordan blinked. The cake was not on the regular menu. Camille raised an eyebrow, watching the woman with a knowing look. Malcolm barely glanced up from his newspaper. But Jordan, he understood exactly what was happening. This was an apology. Not a spoken one, not one that involved actual words, but an apology nonetheless. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jordan could feel the tension. She wanted to say something. She wanted to fix whatever damage had been done. He could see it in the way she shifted, her weight rocking slightly from one foot to the other. But she didn't say anything. And he realized something. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what had happened, afraid of being called out, afraid of consequences, afraid of knowing that she had misjudged him in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. For the first time, Jordan saw things from her perspective. She was the one who felt small now. She was the one questioning if she belonged. And that was something she'd have to sit with. Jordan looked down at the cake for a long moment. Then, very deliberately, he slid the plate toward the center of the tray table. "I don't need special treatment," he said simply, locking eyes with her. The flight attendant's breath caught slightly. She knew what he was saying, and more importantly, she knew why. She nodded stiffly, quickly turning and walking away, leaving the untouched dessert behind. Camille let out a small hum of amusement. That, she said, was powerful. Malcolm didn't say anything, but Jordan caught the slight curve of his lips behind the newspaper. He had noticed, and for the first time since stepping onto this plane, Jordan felt something shift inside himself. Confidence, not just in where he was sitting, but in who he was. The businessman's gaze. A few minutes passed. Jordan let his fingers drum against the armrest, trying to shake the last bit of tension from his chest. But then he noticed something. The businessman across the aisle was still sneaking glances at him. Before, the man had been skeptical, doubtful, one of the people who had silently watched as Jordan was questioned. But now there was something different in his gaze. Not doubt, curiosity. Jordan knew that look. It was the kind of look people gave before they realized they had made a mistake. The kind of look that said, "I didn't expect you to handle this the way you did." The businessman cleared his throat and sat up straighter. "So," he said, addressing Malcolm first, "you own the airline." Malcolm barely spared him a glance. "That's correct." The businessman hesitated. "I see." It was obvious he wanted to say more. But Malcolm wasn't giving him an opening. Instead, he flipped another page of his newspaper, as if the conversation wasn't even worth his time. The businessman turned his gaze to Jordan. "And what about you, young man?" he asked, a forced smile on his lips. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Jordan narrowed his eyes slightly. This was another test. The man wanted to see what kind of answer he'd give. Jordan leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. And then he spoke, clearly, directly, and with no hesitation. "I'm going to run my own company," he said. The businessman blinked. Jordan tilted his head slightly. Maybe aviation. Maybe tech. Maybe something no one's even thought of yet. The businessman's lips parted slightly, caught off guard. Jordan smirked. Either way, I'm gonna make sure nobody ever questions whether I belong. The businessman stared at him for a long second. Then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. Smart kid, he muttered. Jordan didn't need his approval, but he had made sure the man knew. Owning the future. As the flight continued, Jordan sat comfortably in his seat, his shoulders relaxed, his mind clearer than it had been all day. This flight had been more than just a trip. It had been a lesson. A reminder that the world wasn't always fair. That people would always judge based on what they expected to see. But that didn't mean he had to accept it. Because the truth was, he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He just had to be. To own his space. To walk into any room, any building, any boardroom, and carry himself like he belonged. Because he did. His father flipped the last page of his newspaper and folded it neatly, setting it aside. Jordan, he said. Jordan turned to him. Yeah. Malcolm met his gaze, his expression serious but proud. You ready for what's ahead? Jordan smirked. More than ready. His father nodded once, satisfied. Camille reached over and gave Jordan's hand a squeeze. Good. Jordan exhaled, letting himself fully relax. The next time he stepped onto a plane, into a classroom, into a boardroom, he wouldn't just be walking in. He'd be owning the space from the moment he arrived. And that was real power. The legacy of confidence. The gentle hum of the aircraft engines filled the cabin, blending with the occasional clink of glasses and hushed conversations. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, stars scattered like diamonds over a vast ocean of darkness. Jordan Hayes leaned back into his first-class seat, arms crossed, his mind still processing everything that had happened. A few hours ago, he had stepped onto this plane with nothing but excitement. A 12-year-old boy with a love for aviation, ready to experience his first luxury flight. And yet, what had started as a dream had quickly turned into a lesson. A lesson in perception. A lesson in power. A lesson in knowing who he was, and never letting anyone make him question it. Now, as the plane cruised through the sky, Jordan realized something else. This was bigger than just him. Because this wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't even just about a flight. It was about every moment where someone like him had been doubted. Every time a black kid had walked into a room and felt the weight of silent stares. Every time a young boy had been questioned before he even had a chance to speak. Every time someone had been made to feel small in a place where they belonged. Jordan wasn't just carrying his own experience. He was carrying all of it. And now, he knew exactly what to do with that knowledge. The final reminder. A gentle chime rang through the cabin, signaling the beginning of meal service. Flight attendants began moving through first class, handing out trays of gourmet meals, checking in with passengers, their movements professional and fluid. Jordan barely noticed, because something else had caught his attention. The businessman across the aisle. The same man who had doubted him before. Now, he wasn't just sneaking glances. He was watching. Jordan met his gaze, refusing to look away. The man hesitated for a moment, then cleared his throat. Listen, he started, shifting uncomfortably. I might have misjudged the situation earlier. Jordan arched an eyebrow. Might have. Camille, sitting beside him, smirked but said nothing. She was letting Jordan handle this. The businessman adjusted his tie, clearly uneasy. I suppose I was too quick to assume things. Jordan leaned back in his seat, letting the words sink in. It wasn't much, but it was something. Still, he wasn't about to let the man off easy. You weren't the only one, Jordan said simply. The businessman exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. He nodded. No, I wasn't. Silence stretched between them. Then, after a moment, the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, silver business card. Here, he said, sliding it onto Jordan's tray table. If you ever decide to go into business one day, give me a call." Jordan stared at the card for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he picked it up and studied the name. Mark Atwood, Senior Investment Partner. Jordan traced his fingers over the embossed letters. Then, without breaking eye contact, he slipped the card into his pocket. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Instead, he gave the man a single nod, a silent understanding. And that was enough. The future is waiting. As the flight attendant served dinner, Jordan felt his mother's hand rest gently on his. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her pride was in her expression, in the quiet squeeze of her fingers, in the way she watched him, not as a child, but as someone who had just stepped into a greater understanding of himself. Across from them, Malcolm Hayes flipped open his newspaper again, but his eyes lingered on Jordan for a fraction of a second longer than usual. That was his father's way of saying, "You did good, son." Jordan exhaled. It was funny. At the start of this flight, he had just wanted to enjoy first class. But now he was thinking about something much bigger, a promise to himself. As he finished his meal, Jordan found himself staring out the window, watching the moonlight shimmer over the airplane's wing. And he made himself a promise. One day, he wouldn't just sit in first class. One day, he'd own the whole airline, not because he had anything to prove, not because he wanted to show anyone, but because he could, because he belonged, because no one would ever make him question that again. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the business card his father had given him earlier. Malcolm Hayes, CEO. Jordan smirked. Yeah, one day he'd have a card just like it, maybe even bigger. And when he did, he'd make sure that every kid who looked like him, every kid who had ever been doubted, would walk into places like this without hesitation, without needing to prove anything. Because by then, the world would already know. Final descent. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare for landing." Around the cabin, passengers stirred. The businessman adjusted his watch. The woman in the cream blazer packed away her book. The flight attendants moved briskly, collecting trays and making final checks. And Jordan sat still. He wasn't thinking about the landing. He wasn't even thinking about the trip ahead. He was thinking about what came after, about the future, about his future. Camille glanced at him and smiled knowingly. "Thinking big, aren't you?" Jordan turned to her, grinning. "You have no idea." His mother laughed. "That's my boy." Malcolm chuckled as he closed his newspaper for the final time. "Better get ready," he said. "Your journey's just getting started." Jordan fastened his seatbelt. He was ready. The plane dipped lower, slicing through the clouds, the city lights below twinkling like stars. A new destination, a new beginning, a new purpose. And Jordan Hayes, he was walking into it with confidence, because from now on, wherever he went, he belonged. And no one would ever make him question that again.